Hi, I'm your host Vasco Duarte. Welcome to the Scrum Master Toolbox podcast, where we share tips and tricks from Scrum Masters around the world. Every day, we bring you inspiring answers to important questions that all Scrum Masters face day after day. Hello everybody, today is Wednesday and we have with us Fred Deichler. Hey Fred, welcome back.
Hey, thanks for having me back.
Absolutely. So today we talk about change and of course the role we have as Scrum Masters in leading change, being a leadership entity when it comes to change. And we want to hear a story of a change process you were involved with, Fred. And as you go through that story, how it happened, highlight for us the tools, the tips, the tricks, and the techniques you learned back then that you still apply today.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm going to tell you a story that I'm actually currently going through a change. In my current role as a Scrum Master, I've been here at this company for about 3 years. And when I came in, they were doing a modified SAFe model with quarterly planning where everyone would get together and talk about for 2 days, like, what do we want to achieve over the next quarter? And how are we going to go about achieving this? This was big for me because I'd only ever worked with a couple teams before, and I came into there were 6 Scrum teams. So I sat back, I watched for a long time as this process continued before I started putting my hands into it. And what I started observing over time was we created these commitments that we knew we couldn't get to in 90 days.
Oh, so you mean like in the planning, the team was committing to something that they already knew they could not reach in the 90 days of that planning increment?
Yeah, yes. They believed coming out of it that they could, but it was a difference between their heart and their mind. Their heart says we can do it, their heart says we can do it, and their mind was like, but history says you can't. Is that things are going to come up. There's going to be unplanned and unexpected work. And so I took a lot of time every quarter. Like this went from one Scrum Master leading it over to myself after about a year. And I took a look. I re-architected how we did it. I interviewed people. I did retrospectives. I asked questions like, "What do you think is wrong?"
So tell us a little bit more, Fred. You said I re-architected how we did it, but how we did what? Like the preparation for the planning itself, the team's involvement in the definition of the commitments. What do you mean?
Yes, it was the planning itself. I re-architected that. We went from the traditional 2 days to actually stretching it out over a week, because the feedback I got was that teams need more time to decompose the problem. If we only understood the problem better, could we create a better plan?
Okay, that sounds familiar, though. I've seen that fail before, so I'm curious to hear what happened next.
Yeah, like you mentioned, it did fail. And so the first time we did the more hours for planning to create a more detailed plan, it still did not get done. So I'm like, okay, well, we need more planning time, because if we get even more planning time, we get more specific. We can understand. We can account.
That also sounds familiar.
Yeah, we could have a program board, map our dependencies, which it did. Program boarding and mapping dependencies did help quite a bit to understand and be sure things were sequenced over our 10 teams a little bit better, but it still did not give us that confidence in the plan. And so we got a new senior director of product recently, or actually senior vice president of product recently, who challenged us to be different. And so I spent a good part of the summer this year actually thinking, how could we do things differently? I personally see a lot of value in giving ourselves permission to slow down and think about what we want to do next. Because the endless sprinting of a constant calendar, you get in these motions, and you do things because you need to do things versus instead of they're the right thing to do. So I'm a strong believer, like I said, in giving us that permission to slow down and think about what we're going to do before we move on to the next thing. But I realized 3 months was just too long. It was too uncertain. And so I did a lot of research on this. I read articles, listened to podcasts, and I realized that there's this thing called I called it the Agile cone of uncertainty, but it's this phenomenon that there's an increase in uncertainty as you get further away from where you are today, kind of like a radar graph. where it's very specific to being, and then it goes out. And I read something that said quarterly planning. It's simply a high level emergent roadmap for the upcoming quarter, not a commitment to delivery. And just like that time I told about yesterday, I was in the car and I had that aha moment. This hit me. Aha. It's not a commitment to delivery. People felt like they were committing to the delivery, but that's not what it's about.
And actually, that's how the process describes it. So let's not forget that part.
Exactly. But I glossed over that. I was an RTE for a time. I got that certification, release train engineer, but I still somehow I missed it. And that's why I think it's very important, like a lesson just overall sometimes, is to go back and reread things. You'll learn things different because you're at a different point in your understanding. Even the Scrum Guide, going back and reading the Scrum Guide today versus a year ago versus 2 years ago when the last version came out, I read things differently because I understand things differently.
Yeah, absolutely. And from that story, there's a couple of things that I think are worth highlighting. That realization that plans are less certain with time also requires us to think about tools that kind of materialize that uncertainty, right? So, for example, if we put stuff in a backlog and we say this is our next 3 months of things to do, that's too detailed. That does not include the space for uncertainty, right? If we say this is our next sprint and we have these other things that we want to do in this priority order, but we're not committing to delivering this in a quarter, which was what you were talking about. That's a completely different aspect. And then we can add on top of that another level of uncertainty, which is like the sprint backlog has stories. But after that, it's really just features or even epics or even just fuzzy ideas, right? Stuff that we haven't even defined yet. Because if we want to get to the point of being sure the plan works, which is never possible, but there's a temptation to do that comes from our project management background, of course. We want to decompose it, just like you said, which is leaving even less space for uncertainty.
Yeah, absolutely. And the thing, that helped with, I mentioned the senior vice president, he brought in this concept of now, next, later when we looked at our initiatives. What are we doing now? What are we going to do next? What might we do later? So that started to help with our product owner, product manager role to understand that, like, how the commitment loosens over time, how we learn. With the team specifically, they very much wanted, how do we do this? Because they'd been operating this model of building these perfect plans for a long time, including defining out stories in 3 months. And so I had to give them a little bit of how. I said, okay, so at the beginning, this first sprint, you can define your sprint goal and some technical approaches in your planning because you're right there. That's what you're going to do now/next. But I'm like, towards the end, like you mentioned, epics. And so I told them, like, hey, 8 and 13 point stories, which is just for our sizing. I said, these are very common in this space. Please allow them to happen. Just put in that kernel of the idea because you do have time over the quarter to refine that into what the right approach is.
Absolutely. And also we have to accept that it doesn't make sense to refine something we might not even touch because other priorities will emerge. And this is something you mentioned, but it's something that is good to remind not only the teams, but also the product owners and also the stakeholders that, look, remember last month when you came up with that idea of something we needed to do? In order for us to do that, we have to have space in the planning increment or program increment, because if we don't, we can't bring in those ideas, right? And we need that space, that loose plan, right? We know what we want to do, but we accept we might not actually do it because things that are more important will come up.
Absolutely.
And that's a great story of how to adapt the safe planning model to the reality. And I would definitely say my own experience is go with 2 months planning cycles, not 3 months planning cycles. And that's not to say that 2 months is significantly better than 3 months, but at least you know for sure you're not committing to that third month, right? It's much shorter.
Yeah, we went with 3 sprints, so 6 weeks is what I say. I just give me 6 weeks.
Absolutely. Shorter is better if you can pay for the overhead of planning. Of course, that's another thing to consider. Thank you for sharing that, Fred.
You're welcome.
Leading change is one of the core skills we must acquire, but it is only one of the steps towards our success as Scrum Masters. Tomorrow, on Success Thursday, we will talk about how to define success for the Scrum Master role. We'll cover tips on how to measure your way to that position, and most importantly, how to develop that focus on continuous improvement that is as important for Scrum Masters as it is for teams. See you tomorrow. We really hope you liked our show. And if you did, why not rate this podcast on Stitcher or iTunes? Share this podcast and let other Scrum Masters know about this valuable resource for their work. Remember that sharing is caring.